What if evil wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows? What if it wasn't a ghost or a demon? What if it was the 8-year-old boy who lived down the road? A child with a face so innocent it could break your heart, and eyes so empty they could freeze your soul. Tonight, we are not just telling a story. We are opening a doctor's private journal, unsealing a case that was buried for over a century, and looking into the face of something that science still has no name for. This is the story of Timothy, and the chilling truth that proves the most terrifying monsters are the ones we create, and the ones that are born. Our story begins not with a scream, but with a silence, the heavy, humid silence of a Missouri summer in the year 1866. The Civil War had ripped the soul out of the country, and in the small, forgotten farming communities, life was a slow, grueling march from one sunrise to the next. It was in one of these quiet corners of the world that a physician named Dr. Samuel Harding, the only doctor for 50 miles in any direction, began to chronicle the most disturbing case of his entire medical career. Over the next year, he would fill 3 thick, leather-bound journals with his observations of a single child, a boy whose very existence seemed to be a chilling contradiction to everything humanity thought it knew about itself. On the surface, he was a perfect child, polite, hardworking, never causing a bit of trouble. But underneath that mask of innocence, something else was at work, something cold, calculating, and ancient. In the 6 months that followed the boy's arrival, a shadow fell over the small community. 3 people would die in what were called freak accidents. Dozens of farm animals would be discovered mutilated in the dead of night. And at the center of this growing storm of tragedy was a quiet, 8-year-old boy with pale blonde hair and eyes that watched everything, but felt nothing. The official records were eventually sealed, the town's dark secret locked away for more than 100 years. But the truth about Timothy reveals a darkness so profound, it forces us to question the very nature of childhood innocence and evil itself before we proceed with this unsettling account. If stories that explore the darkest corners of history are what you seek, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell. You will not want to miss our journeys into these forgotten truths. And please, tell us in the comments what city or state you are listening from. We cherish the connection we have with our community of fellow explorers into the unknown. The events that would forever stain the name of this small county began not with an act of violence, but with an act of desperation. Missouri in 1867 was a land of ghosts. Every town had a list of names, the young men they had sent off to war who would never return. They left behind hollowed-out farms, grieving widows, and children who would grow up knowing their fathers only as a story. The Caldwell farm, a lonely patch of land nestled in a valley 15 miles south of the nearest town, had once been a symbol of the American dream. James and Martha Caldwell had poured their sweat and hopes into that soil, dreaming of a future filled with cornfields and cattle. But that dream was shattered when James was killed at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in 1860-1. Martha, a strong and determined woman, tried her best to keep the farm alive on her own. But grief and hardship wore her down, and a brutal winter in 1865 claimed her, her lungs finally surrendering to consumption. Their son, Thomas, barely a man himself at 21 years old, inherited a legacy of debt and decay. He was left with land he couldn't possibly work alone, and bills he had no way of paying. It was in the depths of this despair that a letter arrived. It brought news of another death. His brother, William, had perished in the infamous Andersonville prison, leaving behind a young widow and a son, 8 years old. For Thomas, the news was a fresh wave of grief, but it also presented a grim, practical solution. The boy, Timothy, would need a home, and Thomas, more than anything, needed another pair of hands to help fight back the tide of ruin. Thomas Caldwell was a hard man, his heart calloused by war and loss. His wife, Sarah, was a woman soured by years of childless longing, her words often as sharp as broken glass. Their small farmhouse was a place of silent, simmering resentment, hardly a home for any child, let alone one arriving as a stranger. But in the spring of 1866, the boy came. He stepped off a dusty wagon with nothing but a small, worn cloth sack and a pair of eyes that seemed to hold the weight of 100 years. Timothy was small for his age, with skin so pale it seemed almost translucent in the harsh Missouri sun. His blonde hair was kept short and severe by his Aunt Sarah, a practical defense against lice. He was a child of few words, especially about the past. When pressed, he would offer only disconnected fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror. His father had been a soldier. His mother had coughed blood into a white cloth. He had stayed with neighbors for a time after she was gone. But what truly set him apart in the eyes of the adults was his impeccable manners. He was unfailingly polite, always responding with a quiet yes, sir, or yes, ma'am. He accepted the hardest chores without a word of complaint and endured punishment with a stoic silence that was deeply unsettling. In every outward appearance, he was the perfect, obedient child. Dr. Samuel Harding first met Timothy in June of 1866 in the dusty aisle of the town's general store. The boy had accompanied his uncle to pick up supplies. Harding was a man who prided himself on his ability to read people. Years spent treating mangled soldiers on the battlefield had given him a sharp eye for the secrets men tried to hide behind their eyes. But as he made small talk with Thomas, he found his attention drawn to the boy standing silently by his side. There was something about the child that set off a quiet alarm deep within him, a feeling he couldn't name. He later wrote in his journal, "The boy was the very picture of respectfulness. He answered my questions clearly, maintained direct eye contact, and showed none of the nervous fidgeting or shyness so common in rural children meeting a stranger. And yet, I felt a profound and growing discomfort in his presence. His gaze was not that of a child. It was an intense, analytical stare, as if he were studying me with the same cold, clinical interest that I reserve for diagnosing a disease in a patient." In a small farming community like this, secrets were hard to keep, but the Caldwell farm was isolated, set apart from the others, and the family kept to themselves. Still, neighbors noticed things. Mrs. Patterson, a kind woman whose land bordered the Caldwell property, would often see Timothy working in the fields from her kitchen window. She mentioned it to her husband, Samuel, one evening over dinner. "There's something unnatural about the way that boy works," she said, her voice troubled. "He has a focus you don't see in a child. He never seems to tire, Samuel. He never stops to chase a grasshopper or skip a stone. It's like watching a little clockwork man. From sunup to sundown, he just works. It ain't right for a boy to have no joy in him." Mrs. Patterson had also noticed something else, something she couldn't quite explain. Her chickens, normally calm and predictable, would erupt into a panicked frenzy whenever Timothy walked near the fence line that separated their properties. They would squawk and flutter, huddling together in the far corner of their coop, refusing to go anywhere near the boy. Her husband dismissed it as foolishness, but she couldn't shake the chilling feeling that the animals, in their primal way, could sense a wrongness about the boy that the humans, with all their logic, were blind to. The first death occurred on a blistering, sweat-soaked afternoon in August of 1866. Little Mary Fletcher, the 5-year-old daughter of the town blacksmith, was a ray of sunshine in the tired community, known for her infectious giggle and her habit of wandering off to explore. That afternoon, she had been playing near Willow Creek, a shallow, slow-moving stream that meandered between several properties, including the Caldwell farm. It was Timothy who found her. He appeared at the Fletchers' front door just as the family was preparing their evening meal. His clothes were damp, his face was pale, and he wore an expression of what appeared to be genuine distress. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, his voice eerily calm and steady despite his appearance, "I found Mary down by the creek. She isn't breathing, asterisk. She isn't breathing, asterisk." A group of men immediately ran to the creek. They found Mary Fletcher face down in the murky water that was barely 18 inches deep. Dr. Harding was summoned. His initial examination confirmed the obvious, a tragic, accidental drowning. It was a heartbreaking, but sadly common occurrence in a place where water was a part of daily life, and supervision was often lax. But what began to gnaw at Dr. Harding was not the death itself, but Timothy's account of the discovery. The boy provided a description of the scene that was chilling in its precision. He described the exact spot where he found Mary, the precise angle of her body, the way her blue dress had been snagged on a submerged tree branch. When Harding pressed him about how he happened to be in that specific, secluded spot at that exact time, Timothy calmly explained he had been searching for a lost calf. The boy's memory was unnervingly perfect. Harding wrote in his journal that night. He could recall the exact position of the deceased child's limbs, the color of the water that lapped around her face. Such meticulous attention to detail seemed profoundly strange for a young child who claimed to be so horrified and upset by what he had seen. Thomas Caldwell later confirmed that one of their calves had, in fact, been missing that morning, and he had sent Timothy to search along the creek. The calf was found 2 days later, unharmed, grazing peacefully in a meadow nearly a mile away from where Mary had drowned. The Fletcher family, consumed by their grief, clung to Timothy as a small hero. He was the one who had found their daughter, who had brought the terrible news so they could bring her home. At the funeral, Timothy sat quietly between his aunt and uncle, his head bowed in a perfect picture of sorrow. He even told Mary's heartbroken father, "I wish I could have found her sooner," his voice laced with just the right amount of regret. But Mrs. Patterson, watching from a pew across the small church, noticed something that would stay with her forever. As Mary's mother let out a gut-wrenching wail and collapsed in grief, as hardened farmers wiped tears from their eyes at the sight of the tiny wooden coffin, Timothy's expression remained a perfect, unchanging mask. When he thought no one was looking, he lifted his head just slightly, and his pale blue eyes, dry and observant, scanned the scene, taking in every tear, every sob, every detail of the raw human suffering around him. The second death followed just 3 weeks later. Old Henrik Larsson, a Norwegian immigrant and retired logger, was found at the bottom of a steep, rocky cliff known to the locals as Devil's Bluff. The cliff overlooked the very same creek where Mary Fletcher had died. Henrik was a creature of habit, and he was known to climb the bluff regularly to tend to the wild beehives he kept there. And once again, Timothy Caldwell was at the center of the discovery. He claimed he was walking home from town when he spotted something out of place. At the base of the cliff, "I saw Mr. Larsson's hat caught on a thorn bush," Timothy explained to the small crowd that quickly gathered. "I called his name, but there was no answer, so I went down to look. Henrik Larsson was dead, his neck broken in a way that suggested a fall from the 40-foot bluff." Dr. Harding's examination concluded he had likely died instantly on impact. The only thing unusual about the scene was the presence of a small cluster of dead bees, scattered on the ground around the body, far more than one would expect to find away from a hive. Old Henrik knew these bluffs like the back of his hand. Samuel Patterson told Dr. Harding later he'd been climbing them for years, never so much as stumbled. "It just doesn't make any sense that he would fall now." Timothy, when questioned, offered a plausible theory. "Maybe the bees got him," he suggested, his tone thoughtful. "He was always talking about how angry they get when you disturb them. Maybe they swarmed him, and he got confused and lost his footing." The explanation seemed to make sense, but it didn't sit right with Harding. The dead bees were all concentrated in one small area, right around where Henrik's body had landed. If he had disturbed a hive at the top of the cliff, shouldn't there be more signs of bee activity along the path he fell? Instead, it was as if the bees had somehow been gathered and dropped in that one specific spot. When Harding later climbed to the top of the bluff himself, he found the beehives calm, intact, and showing no signs of any recent disturbance. The third death obliterated any lingering thoughts of coincidence. In September, A 6-year-old boy named Jacob Mills vanished while playing in the woods near his family's small cabin. The entire community turned out to search for him. Timothy Caldwell volunteered eagerly. For 3 long days, he searched alongside the grown men, showing a level of endurance and determination that was astonishing for a boy his age. He seemed to have an innate knowledge of the dense woods, guiding search parties through paths that even longtime residents found confusing. On the 4th day, as a cold dawn broke and hope was beginning to fade, Timothy appeared at the Mills cabin. "I think I found something," he told Jacob's distraught father, his voice thick with what sounded like exhaustion. "There's an old, abandoned well about a half-mile north of here. I thought I heard a sound, like someone crying." He led the men to the spot. The well was almost completely hidden, covered by a thick tangle of fallen logs and overgrown brush. And at the bottom of it, they found Jacob. He was alive, but just barely, suffering from severe dehydration and exposure. Dr. Harding was called immediately, but it was too late. The little boy died just a few hours after being pulled from the well, his small body too weak to recover from the 4-day ordeal. "That child was at the bottom of that well for days," Harding wrote in his journal, his hand shaking. The fact that Timothy was the one to locate him in such an impossibly obscure location raises a number of deeply troubling questions. But what was even more troubling to Harding was Timothy's behavior during Jacob's final, fading hours. While the Mills family wept and prayed around their dying son, Timothy sat quietly in a corner of the cabin, his head bowed as if in prayer. But Harding, watching him from a distance, saw the truth. Timothy wasn't praying. His lips were moving silently, but his eyes were fixed on Jacob with a chilling, scientific intensity. He seemed to be observing, cataloging every detail of the boy's final struggle: the shallow, ragged breaths, the pale, clammy skin, the way his consciousness flickered in and out like a dying candle. When Jacob finally took his last breath, Timothy's face showed no trace of grief or shock. Instead, there was an expression that Harding could only describe as a quiet, profound satisfaction. After the funeral, Dr. Harding made an excuse to ride out and examine the abandoned well one more time. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the story. The well was, indeed, incredibly well hidden. It would have taken a significant effort for a grown man to move the heavy logs that concealed it, let alone for a small boy to fall in by accident. As Harding examined the scene more closely, he noticed something the initial rescue party had missed in their desperate hurry. The debris around the rim of the well had not fallen there by chance. The logs and branches showed signs of deliberate placement, arranged to create a natural-looking camouflage that would be almost impossible to spot, unless one knew exactly where to look. The implication sent a wave of ice through Harding's veins. Jacob Mills had not simply fallen into that well. Someone had put him there, and that same someone had carefully concealed the location, leaving him to die a slow, agonizing death, only to discover him at the last possible moment. That evening, Dr. Harding began to keep a separate, secret journal dedicated entirely to his observations of Timothy Caldwell. If his horrifying suspicions were correct, this child was not just troubled. He was a predator, a danger to the entire community. But suspicions were not proof, and evidence was something Harding desperately lacked. The problem was Timothy's perfect facade. He was, to all outward appearances, a model child. He attended church, worked tirelessly, and spoke to his elders with a quiet respect that charmed everyone. And most importantly, he had a perfectly plausible reason for being present at each and every tragedy. He was looking for a lost calf. He was walking home from town. He was helping with the search. But Harding's years as a doctor had taught him to look for the disease beneath the healthy-looking skin. He had seen it in soldiers who killed not for duty, but for pleasure. There was a coldness, a profound disconnect from normal human emotion that manifested in subtle ways: too little reaction to horror, too much interest in the suffering of others. Timothy Caldwell displayed all of these traits, but they were hidden behind the innocent face of an 8-year-old boy. Dr. Harding's secret investigation began in earnest in October of 1866. He used his position as the community's physician as a cover, making regular visits to farms and homes throughout the area, claiming he was checking on the health of families still recovering from the war. In reality, he was gathering information, piecing together a terrifying puzzle. What he discovered was a widening circle of misfortune and death with Timothy at its absolute center. Livestock on farms neighboring the Caldwell property had been dying at an alarming rate, and not from any known disease. Chickens were being found with their necks snapped with surgical precision. Pigs were suffering from mysterious wounds that would inevitably become infected. Horses were suddenly going lame, forcing farmers to put them down. Mrs. Patterson confided in him that she had lost 17 chickens in just 2 months. "It's the strangest thing I've ever seen," she whispered, looking over her shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. "They're killed so neatly. It's not the work of a fox." When Harding examined the most recent casualties himself, he found her suspicions were correct. The chickens had been killed with a precise application of force to a specific point on their necks, a technique that required a disturbing knowledge of anatomy. This was not the random violence of a predator. It was the deliberate, controlled work of an experimenter. The pattern was the same on other farms. James Wickham had lost 3 calves to what he could only describe as freak accidents. Animals that had somehow managed to get themselves tangled in ropes or wedged in fences in ways that defied all logic. In every single case, the affected farms were within walking distance of the Caldwell property. And in almost every case, someone remembered seeing Timothy walking nearby around the time of the incident. "I saw him walking our fence line that very morning," James Wickham told Harding. "I thought it was odd, him being so far from home, but he was always so polite, waved and called out a greeting, just like he was taught." Dr. Harding also began to pay much closer attention to Timothy during his regular medical visits to the Caldwell farm. The boy was always present, a silent shadow in the room, watching as Harding examined his aunt and uncle. But Harding noticed the boy's gaze was not one of idle curiosity. He watched with an intense, focused interest, asking questions about anatomy and medical procedures that were shockingly advanced. For a child his age, how can you be certain someone is truly dead? Timothy asked him during one visit, his tone as casual and detached as if he were asking about the weather. "Sometimes they only appear to be sleeping." When Harding pressed him to explain his strange curiosity, Timothy had a ready, reasonable answer. "Uncle Thomas says I need to know how to handle emergencies, since we're so far from town." The explanation was plausible, but the question itself deeply disturbed Harding. There was a cold, clinical quality to the boy's interest in death and injury that went far beyond normal childhood curiosity. He asked about the mechanics of dying, the signs to look for, the survivability of various traumas, all with the detached interest of a medical student studying a textbook. During these conversations, Harding began to subtly test Timothy, feeding him deliberately false medical information. He would claim certain injuries were always fatal when they were not, or that specific symptoms indicated a particular disease. Timothy never challenged these false statements directly, but Harding saw the way the boy absorbed every piece of information, filing it away with perfect, chilling retention. What was even more disturbing was Timothy's reaction to Harding's stories about treating wounded soldiers during the war. While most children would recoil in horror at tales of battlefield amputations and gruesome injuries, Timothy would listen with a rapt, unblinking attention, asking for more and more detail. "Did they scream a great deal when you sawed off their limbs?" he asked once, his pale blue eyes locked on Harding's face. "Or were they in too much pain to make a sound?" The question, delivered in Timothy's characteristically polite, quiet tone, sent a shard of ice through Dr. Harding's heart that he would never forget. By November of 1866, Dr. Harding had filled nearly 2 entire journals with his meticulous observations of Timothy Caldwell. The portrait that was emerging was not of a child, but of a monster in a child's skin, a creature that possessed an adult's understanding of violence and death, combined with a complete and terrifying absence of normal human empathy. But his notes were not evidence, and he knew he would need undeniable evidence if he was going to protect the community from what he increasingly believed was a human predator in their midst. His opportunity came in an unexpected form when Thomas Caldwell severely injured his back. During the fall harvest, the injury confined him to bed and required daily medical visits from Dr. Harding, giving the doctor unprecedented access to the Caldwell household and to Timothy. During these visits, he began to engage the boy in longer, more probing conversations, carefully trying to map the dark landscape of his mind. What he discovered exceeded his worst nightmares. Timothy Caldwell, he concluded, had been conducting gruesome experiments on living creatures for months, possibly even years. Through a combination of careful questioning and his own observations, Harding became convinced that the boy had been systematically capturing and torturing small animals, meticulously studying their responses to various forms of injury and distress. Timothy had once casually mentioned a small cave hidden deep in the woods, a place he said he went to think and be alone. One afternoon, driven by a dreadful certainty, Harding found the cave. The scene inside was a monument to organized cruelty. There was a collection of animal bones, sorted by size and species. There were crude surgical instruments, fashioned from sharpened farm tools, and covering the walls were a series of detailed drawings, rendered with a surprising and horrifying artistic skill. They depicted rabbits, squirrels, birds, and even larger animals in various stages of dissection and mutilation. Each drawing was accompanied by neat, handwritten notes, documenting the animal's reactions, the exact time it took to die, and cold observations about which methods of torture caused the most suffering. Subject remained conscious for approximately 10 minutes after removal of the eyes. Read one notation beside a detailed drawing of a rabbit. Vocalizations decreased in intensity over time. All movement ceased after sustained pressure was applied to the throat. Harding finally understood. The accidental deaths of livestock on the neighboring farms were not accidents at all. They were the result of Timothy's desire to escalate his experiments, to test his methods on larger, more complex subjects. But the most chilling discovery of all was a newer set of drawings, kept separately from the others. These sketches did not depict animals. They depicted human figures. They showed children and adults in various poses of pain and terror. One drawing showed a small girl who was unmistakably Mary Fletcher. Another showed an old man who could only be Henrik Larsson. And a third showed a small boy at the bottom of a well, with detailed annotations about the physiological effects of dehydration and exposure on the human body. Timothy Caldwell had not just been a passive observer at the scenes of these tragedies. He had been the architect. He had planned each death with methodical precision, executed those plans flawlessly, and then documented the results for his future studies. And as Dr. Harding stood there in the cold, damp cave, he had the sickening realization that the horror in Sedalia County was far from over. If this story is sending shivers down your spine, share this video with a friend who appreciates a journey into the dark. Hit that like button to show your support, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss another chapter from our library of fear. Let's find out together what happens next. Dr. Harding found himself in an impossible, terrifying position. The evidence in the cave was undeniable proof that Timothy Caldwell was responsible for at least 3 deaths, but it was evidence he had obtained by trespassing and illegal search. Furthermore, the very idea that an 8-year-old child could be a calculating, systematic killer was so far beyond the pale of accepted human understanding that he knew no court, no jury, no one would ever believe him. The medical science of 1867 had no framework, no vocabulary for what we might now call antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy. The prevailing belief of the era was that children were born as blank slates of innocence, and that any evil they displayed was the result of corruption or trauma. The concept that a child could be born without the capacity for empathy, without a moral compass, was quite literally inconceivable to most people. Harding knew that if he presented his findings to the local authorities, he would be dismissed as a man whose mind had been broken by the horrors of war. The evidence would be explained away, Timothy would be pitied as a traumatized orphan, and the killings would undoubtedly continue. So, Harding made a dangerous decision. He decided to confront the monster directly. During his next visit to the Caldwell farm, he asked the boy to walk with him to check on the livestock in a distant pasture. Once they were completely alone, with nothing but the open fields and the wide sky around them, Harding revealed what he had discovered in the cave. Timothy's reaction was nothing like what Harding had expected. The boy showed no shock, no denial, and most chillingly, no fear at being caught. Instead, he listened with a calm, patient expression as Harding described the gruesome drawings and the cold-blooded notes. He even nodded occasionally, as if confirming the accuracy of the doctor's observations. When Harding had finished speaking, Timothy looked up at him and said, "You are not going to tell anyone." It was not a question. It was not a plea. It was a statement of absolute fact, delivered with an unshakable confidence. "And why wouldn't I?" Harding asked, genuinely curious to hear the boy's reasoning. Timothy smiled. It was the first genuine, spontaneous expression of emotion that Dr. Harding had ever seen on his face, and it was the most terrifying thing he had ever witnessed. "Because no one in the world would believe you," the boy said simply, "and because you, doctor, are far too curious to see what I will do next." The boy was right on both counts. Harding knew his wild claims would sound like the ravings of a lunatic, but Timothy had also exposed a truth that the doctor was reluctant to admit, even to himself, a dark, scientific fascination with observing the development of what might be the most perfect predator, the most dangerous human being he had ever encountered. "How long have you been doing this?" Harding asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Since I was 5, Timothy replied, matter-of-factly. "Perhaps earlier. I began with insects, then mice, then larger things. It is fascinating to see how different organisms react to the same stimuli." "And the people who died?" Harding pressed. Timothy shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture. "They were experiments as well. I wanted to see if humans would react in the same manner as the animals. They do, for the most part, but they are better at comprehending what is happening to them. Their fear is more complex. That makes it far more interesting." Dr. Harding felt a chill that had nothing to do with the crisp November air. "What are you planning to do next?" Timothy considered the question with the seriousness of a scholar. "I need to study the effects of betrayal," he said finally. "I need to find out what happens when you inflict pain on someone who trusts you completely, someone who would never suspect a thing until it was far, far too late." The implication was as clear as it was horrifying. Timothy was planning to murder his aunt and uncle. Harding knew he had to act, and act fast. He might only have days, perhaps just hours, before Timothy carried out his next experiment. That evening, he rode his horse into Sedalia and went straight to the home of Sheriff William Crawford. Crawford was a pragmatic, no-nonsense man who had served with distinction in the Union Army. He had little time for wild theories or speculation, but he also had a deep respect for Dr. Harding's judgment. Harding laid out his case carefully, methodically, focusing on the verifiable facts rather than his psychological theories. He showed the sheriff the detailed sketches he had made of the drawings in the cave. He pointed out the undeniable pattern of deaths and accidents that all centered around Timothy. And most importantly, he told the sheriff of Timothy's stated intention to kill his aunt and uncle. This was the one piece of information that Crawford could not ignore. "No matter how unbelievable the source, even if only half of what you're telling me is true," Sheriff Crawford said, his face grim as he examined the disturbing drawings with a growing sense of alarm. We cannot arrest a child based on drawings and suspicions, but we can watch him, and we can be ready to act the moment he makes a move. The two men spent the rest of the night developing a careful, strategic plan. They brought in two of Crawford's most trusted deputies, men who had served under him during the war and who could be counted on to remain calm under pressure. The plan was this: Dr. Harding would arrive at the Caldwell farm at his usual time the next morning. He would bring a strong dose of laudanum, ostensibly for Thomas's back pain, but in reality, to keep both Thomas and Sarah heavily sedated, making them difficult targets for Timothy. Sheriff Crawford and his deputies would position themselves in the woods surrounding the farm, close enough to intervene in a matter of seconds, but far enough away to remain unseen. The plan was put into motion at dawn the following morning. As Dr. Harding approached the farmhouse in his buggy, he felt an immediate sense of dread. The usual morning sounds of a working farm, the crowing of the rooster, the lowing of cattle, were absent. The property was shrouded in an eerie, unsettling silence that made the hair on his arms stand up. Before Harding had even climbed down from his buggy, Timothy appeared in the doorway of the farmhouse. He stood perfectly still, his pale blue eyes tracking the doctor's every movement with a sharp, predatory focus. He was dressed in his usual work clothes, but Harding noticed that the boy's sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, and his hands and forearms looked as though they had been scrubbed raw. The kind of thorough cleaning one might perform in preparation for a messy task. "Good morning, Dr. Harding," Timothy said, his voice carrying its usual, unnerving politeness. But underneath the calm surface, there was a new energy, a crackling anticipation, an excitement that the boy was struggling to contain. "I have been waiting for you." The words sent a fresh wave of ice through Harding's veins. The boy's use of the word waiting implied that he had been expecting this very visit, had perhaps even incorporated it into whatever monstrous plan he had set in motion. Inside the house, Harding found Thomas and Sarah Caldwell in their bedroom, both seemingly asleep. But as he approached the bed to check on Thomas, he saw immediately that this was no natural sleep. The man's breathing was alarmingly shallow, and his skin had taken on a grayish, waxy pallor. "What did you give them?" Harding asked quietly, not turning to look at Timothy, but feeling the boy's intense gaze on the back of his neck. "Just some herbs I found in the woods," Timothy replied, his tone one of perfect innocence, but his words chosen with deliberate care. "There are so many interesting plants that grow wild in this area. Some of them have very useful properties." Harding checked Thomas's pulse. It was weak, but steady. Sarah showed the same symptoms. They were both deeply unconscious, but still alive. Whatever poison Timothy had used, he had been careful, precise with the dosage. The boy wanted his victims helpless, but alive, at least for now. "They are not going to wake up for several hours," Timothy continued, his voice conversational. "That should give us more than enough time to talk, without any interruptions." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Dr. Harding had ever experienced, or would ever experience again. Timothy spoke about murder, pain, and torture with the cool, clinical detachment of a medical professor delivering a lecture on anatomy. He described his experiments on both animals and humans with a chilling scientific precision, explaining his methodologies and the valuable insights he had gained from each death. "Mary Fletcher taught me that drowning is actually a surprisingly slow process," Timothy said, settling comfortably into a chair as if they were about to begin a pleasant afternoon chat. "Everyone assumes people just slip beneath the water and it's over. But that is not how it works at all. There's a great deal of struggling and panic, and then there is a most interesting pattern of breathing attempts. Before the subject finally gives up, I was required to hold her head down for almost 3 full minutes. Before she finally stopped fighting, Dr. Harding felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. You held her under the water." Timothy nodded eagerly, like a student proud of his work. "She was playing by the creek. I told her I had found a beautiful, smooth stone on the bottom. When she bent over to look, I simply pushed her head down and held it there. She was so small that it did not require much strength, but she fought much harder than I had anticipated. It was then that I realized that humans possess a far stronger survival instinct than animals. Henrik Larsson, now that was a more complex problem, Timothy admitted, a thoughtful look on his face. I could not overpower him physically, so I was forced to be more creative. I knew that he checked his beehives every Thursday morning. So, the night before, I went up to the bluff and I loosened some of the large stones along the edge of the cliff. Then, I collected a great number of bees from one of his own hives and placed them inside a cloth bag. Timothy's eyes gleamed with a prideful light as he recalled his methods. When Mr. Larsson climbed up to check on his hives, I was waiting for him. Hidden behind some large rocks, I threw the bag of bees directly at his face and began shouting that he was being attacked by a massive swarm. He panicked, just as I knew he would. He stumbled backward, right over the edge where I had weakened the stone barrier. The fall killed him instantly. The calculations were perfect. And Jacob Mills, Timothy said, his voice now taking on the tone of a master teacher sharing a particularly fascinating lesson. Jacob was the most interesting of all. I did not want to kill him quickly, like the others. I wanted to observe what would happen to a human subject if they were to die slowly, over a period of several days. So, I convinced him to follow me deep into the woods by telling him I had found a nest of baby raccoons. Timothy paused, a faint smile playing on his lips as he savored the memory. Jacob was so concerned about the imaginary baby animals that he did not think twice about the potential danger. I helped him climb down into the well. Then I carefully moved the logs and brushed back into place to cover the opening. I visited him every day for days. I would bring him just enough water to keep him alive, but not enough to allow him to recover his strength. It was a fascinating study in degradation. Dr. Harding realized that Timothy was no longer speaking about past experiments. The boy had a specific, terrible plan, and it was unfolding right now, in this very house. "What are you planning to do with your aunt and uncle?" Harding asked, his voice low and direct. Timothy's genuine, terrifying smile returned, wider and more chilling than Harding had ever seen it. "Ah, that is where you come in, Doctor. You see, all of my previous experiments have been conducted on subjects who were unaware of what was happening to them until it was too late. But you are different. You understand exactly what I am and what I am capable of. That makes you the perfect subject for a completely new and exciting type of study." As Timothy spoke, he began to move calmly round the room, gathering items that Harding recognized as potential instruments of torture. A thick rope from the barn, a heavy brass candlestick from the mantelpiece, several sharp-looking implements from the kitchen. The boy organized his tools on a small table with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. I want to find out what happens when a subject who knows they are going to die is forced to try and save others they care about, Timothy continued, his voice trembling with a barely contained excitement. "Will you sacrifice yourself in a futile attempt to save your Uncle Thomas and your Aunt Sarah? Will you try to fight me, even though you know I have anticipated that very possibility? Or will you try to run away and abandon them to their fate in order to save yourself?" There are so many fascinating variables to observe. Dr. Harding knew that the time for conversation, for observation, was over. He drew the heavy pistol from his medical bag and aimed it squarely at the boy. "Step away from the knives, Timothy," Harding said, his voice remarkably steady despite the frantic pounding of his heart. Timothy looked at the pistol not with fear, but with a detached, academic interest. "That is a Navy Colt, is it not?" he asked conversationally. "I have seen pictures of them in books about the war. How many bullets does it hold?" "6, Harding replied automatically, and immediately cursed himself for providing the information. "And how many people are you attempting to protect, Doctor?" Timothy asked, taking a step closer. "There is Uncle Thomas, Aunt Sarah, yourself, and I presume the 3 law enforcement officers positioned outside." That makes 6 people, if my count is correct. So, you see, even if you do manage to shoot me, you will have exhausted all of your ammunition." Timothy moved closer still, now well within striking distance, no longer bothering to stay out of the pistol's range. "You want to know what I am, don't you, Doctor?" he said, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. "You want to understand if I was born this way, or if something made me this way. You want to know if there are others like me out there in the world, and how to recognize them before they begin their own experiments." Every statement was a poisoned dart of truth, and Timothy's ability to identify and exploit Harding's own intellectual curiosity was as frightening as his capacity for physical violence. The boy understood people on a level that was almost supernatural, and he could predict their behavior and manipulate their responses, even when they knew they were being manipulated. The final confrontation came as Timothy picked up a length of rope and approached his sleeping uncle. Dr. Harding stepped forward to block his path, but Timothy moved with a blinding speed and strength that was shocking in a child so small. He produced a kitchen knife from his belt and slashed at the doctor's arm, opening a deep gash. The struggle that followed was brief, chaotic, and brutal. Timothy fought with the desperate, cornered ferocity of a wild animal. Using the knife with a skill that spoke of countless hours of practice, Harding managed to grab the boy's wrist and twist until he dropped the knife. But Timothy immediately produced another, smaller blade from a sheath hidden in his boot. It became horrifyingly clear that the boy had prepared for this. With multiple weapons hidden and positioned strategically throughout the house, the sound of their violent struggle finally brought Sheriff Crawford and his deputies crashing through the back door. They burst into the room to find a scene of pure chaos. Dr. Harding, bleeding from his arm, wrestling with the small, snarling boy, while Thomas and Sarah Caldwell lay motionless on their bed, oblivious to the life and death struggle happening just feet away. A deputy quickly and efficiently subdued Timothy, while Harding, breathing heavily, rushed to check on the unconscious couple. When the dust finally settled, Timothy Caldwell sat calmly in the corner of the room, his clothes torn and his face bruised and bloodied, but his pale blue eyes still holding that same cold, terrifying intelligence that had first unsettled Dr. Harding so many months earlier. "You cannot prove anything," Timothy said, his voice calm, and even as the deputies bound him tightly with ropes. "Nobody in the world will ever believe that a child did all of those things." Sheriff Crawford looked down at the boy with a mixture of profound disgust and morbid fascination. "Maybe not, son," he said, his voice heavy, "but we do not have to prove everything. Attempting to murder your own family is more than enough to see you locked away for a very, very long time, regardless of your age." Timothy smiled at that, the same genuine, chilling smile Harding had seen before. "You will not hang me," he said with an absolute, unshakable confidence. "I am too young, and I am far too interesting. Someone, somewhere, will want to study me instead." Just when we thought the nightmare was over, the true horror of this case was only just beginning. If this story is holding you in its grip, share this video with a friend who understands the allure of the dark. Hit that like button to support our work, and please subscribe, so you never miss another journey into the abyss. Let's find out together what became of this terrible little boy. Timothy was wrong about his ultimate fate, but he was chillingly correct about the impossibility of proving the true extent of his crimes. When Sheriff Crawford tried to present the evidence from the cave, the drawings, the notes, the bones to the county prosecutors, he was met with the exact wall of disbelief that Dr. Harding had predicted. The drawings were dismissed as the dark but harmless fantasies of a deeply disturbed and traumatized child. The shocking pattern of deaths and accidents was written off as a series of tragic, statistically improbable coincidences. However, the attempted murder of Thomas and Sarah Caldwell could not be so easily explained away. 3 sworn law enforcement officers had witnessed Timothy attacking his sleeping relatives with a clear and undeniable intent to kill. Even the most sympathetic observers could not argue that an 8-year-old boy would do such a thing unless something was fundamentally and dangerously wrong with him. The legal system of 1867 was completely unprepared to deal with a child like Timothy. He was too young to be prosecuted as an adult, but he was far too dangerous to be placed in a standard orphanage or reformatory. The case created an unprecedented legal and moral crisis for the state of Missouri, attracting the attention of legal scholars and medical professionals from all over the country. After weeks of intense legal wrangling and consultations with experts from as far away as Boston and Philadelphia, a compromise was finally reached. Timothy would be remanded to the custody of the Missouri State Hospital for the Insane in Fulton, where he would be studied and, it was hoped, treated by the most advanced alienists, what we would now call psychiatrists, available in the region. The decision satisfied no one completely. Prosecutors still wanted Timothy tried for murder, while his court-appointed defense attorneys argued that no child so young could truly be held responsible for his actions. Dr. Samuel Harding, feeling a profound sense of responsibility for the boy he had discovered, volunteered to accompany Timothy to the hospital. He remained there for 3 months, meticulously documenting the boy's behavior and working closely with the hospital staff to help them understand the unique nature of the patient they were dealing with. The resulting case study became one of the first systematic and detailed examinations of what we would now recognize as psychopathy in a child, although it would not be published until many decades after the events took place. Timothy, for his part, adapted to life in the hospital with the same cold, calculating intelligence he had shown on the farm. He quickly learned to mimic the appropriate emotions and responses, masterfully convincing several of the younger, more idealistic staff members that he was making remarkable progress in overcoming his traumatic episodes. He could produce convincing tears when discussing his crimes, express a remorse that seemed heartbreakingly genuine, and display a touching gratitude for the care he was receiving. But Dr. Harding, watching from a distance, saw the truth. Timothy was not healing. He was studying. He was observing the people around him, learning their weaknesses, their desires, their fears, and learning how to manipulate them more effectively. The boy was creating a comprehensive, internal catalog of human emotional responses, and he could reproduce these signals with a stunning accuracy, despite feeling none of the underlying emotions himself. The subject displays a cognitive ability that is nothing short of remarkable. Dr. Harding wrote in one of his detailed reports to the hospital board, "This is coupled with a complete and total absence of any genuine emotional response. He has learned to simulate normal human reactions, with a skill sufficient to deceive even a trained observer in a brief interaction. He understands happiness as the expression people make when they want a pleasant situation to continue, and he understands sadness as the expression people make when they want others to offer them comfort and assistance. But he has never, in my opinion, actually experienced either of these emotions himself." Harding's evaluation also uncovered the horrifying extent of Timothy's violent fantasies and his detailed plans for the future. Once the boy believed he had gained Harding's trust, pretending to be fascinated by the scientific approach to studying his own mind, he began to share his ideas for future experiments. These were plans that made his past crimes seem almost restrained and unimaginative by comparison. He has developed elaborate, multi-stage scenarios for testing human responses to various forms of intense psychological and physical torture, Harding reported in a confidential letter to a colleague in Philadelphia. His plans demonstrated diabolical creativity and a sophisticated, intuitive understanding of human psychology. If this individual is ever allowed to mature and gain access to additional resources, he will, without a doubt, become one of the most prolific and dangerous predators in American history. The official hospital records show that Timothy remained a patient at the facility for 18 months. During that time, A number of unexplained and disturbing incidents occurred that bore all the hallmarks of his unique methods. Other patients were found dead in circumstances that were officially ruled as accidental or due to natural causes, but which, when examined more closely, showed disturbing patterns of deliberate planning. 3 elderly patients, all of whom had been in relatively good health, died from what was recorded as sudden heart failure, all within days of having prolonged interactions with Timothy. 2 younger, more agitated patients suffered what appeared to be accidental falls that resulted in serious, life-altering injuries. Both of these incidents occurred in areas of the hospital where Timothy had been seen loitering earlier in the day. But most disturbing of all were the persistent reports from other patients who claimed that Timothy had been visiting their rooms at night, standing silently beside their beds for hours, simply watching them sleep. The hospital staff who worked most closely with Timothy also began to experience a range of unusual and unsettling problems. Several nurses reported being plagued by persistent, vivid nightmares after spending time with the boy. Dreams that were often filled with detailed and gruesome scenarios of violence and death. 2 male attendants requested transfers to other wards, claiming that they had the constant, unnerving feeling of being watched, even when they knew for a fact that Timothy was confined to his room. A brilliant young psychiatrist from Boston, a Dr. Martha Fitzgerald, was brought in to provide additional expertise in treating the hospital's most difficult case. She was the one who discovered that the boy had been keeping a secret journal. Timothy had cleverly convinced one of the more sympathetic nurses to provide him with paper and a pencil for what he called therapeutic writing exercises, claiming that recording his thoughts and feelings would help him to process his emotions more effectively. On the surface, the journal appeared to contain exactly what Timothy had claimed. It was filled with daily entries describing his thoughts, his deep regrets about his past actions, and his fervent hopes for a future rehabilitation. The writing was appropriately childlike in its language and emotional content, painting a convincing picture of a deeply troubled but fundamentally redeemable young person, struggling to overcome a traumatic past. But Dr. Fitzgerald's advanced training in European psychiatric techniques included a familiarity with ciphers and coded communication. As she studied the journal more closely, she began to notice a subtle but persistent pattern in the boy's choice of words and sentence structure. She discovered that the innocent-seeming entries contained a sophisticated and complex cipher system. The decoded messages revealed Timothy's true thoughts and plans in horrifying detail. He was not experiencing remorse or rehabilitation. He was conducting a systematic and ruthless study of the hospital, its staff, its routines, and its security procedures. His ultimate goal was not merely to escape, but to use his time in confinement to develop and refine more advanced techniques for manipulation and murder. Day 47 read one of the decoded entries. Dr. F is now fully convinced that my tears during today's session were authentic. Her response pattern indicates a significant increase in sympathy and a corresponding decrease in professional suspicion. I estimate that 3 more weeks of consistent emotional performance will be required to establish a sufficient level of trust to allow for unsupervised physical contact during our sessions. The discovery of Timothy's coded journal led to an immediate and drastic tightening of security procedures around him. But Timothy adapted to these changes with his characteristic flexibility and intelligence, seamlessly shifting his focus from psychological manipulation to a more direct gathering of information about the hospital's routines and potential escape routes. In the summer of 1868, Timothy Caldwell vanished from the Missouri State Hospital under circumstances that were never fully explained. The official investigation concluded that he had somehow managed to slip away during a transfer between buildings, despite being under the constant supervision of multiple guards. Dr. Harding, however, always suspected that Timothy's escape had been far more sophisticated and complex than the official report suggested. The boy had demonstrated a remarkable capacity for patience and long-term planning throughout his confinement, and it seemed overwhelmingly likely that he had spent many months meticulously preparing for his departure. Evidence that was discovered in the weeks after his disappearance suggested that he had been manipulating the facility's staff far more successfully than anyone had ever realized. Several guards reported having made small, seemingly harmless policy exceptions for Timothy in the weeks leading up to his escape, allowing him slightly longer exercise periods, providing him with extra reading materials, making minor adjustments to his daily routine that, individually, seemed insignificant, but collectively, may have created the perfect window of opportunity for him to disappear. He spent a year and a half of his young life engaged in an intensive study of that facility and its personnel, Dr. Harding wrote in his final, confidential report on the case. By the time he made his move, he understood the psychology of every single person who worked there better than they understood themselves. His escape was not an act of childish desperation. It was the culmination of a brilliant, carefully executed, and utterly terrifying plan. In the months and years that followed Timothy's disappearance, Dr. Harding began to collect newspaper clippings and reports of suspicious deaths and accidents from all across the Midwest. Many of these incidents bore disturbing hallmarks that seemed chillingly consistent with Timothy's known methods, carefully staged accidents that resulted in death, evidence of the systematic torture of animals, and often the peripheral presence of a quiet, polite, and unusually helpful young boy. The challenge, Harding knew, was that Timothy would now be older, bigger, potentially strong enough to overpower adult victims, and certainly sophisticated enough to avoid the mistakes that had led to his initial capture. His time spent in intensive study of human psychology at the hospital, combined with his natural intelligence and his complete lack of any moral restraint, had created something new and unprecedented in the annals of American criminal history. Dr. Harding spent the remaining years of his career tracking these reports, a lonely and obsessed hunter, attempting to develop a comprehensive understanding of what Timothy Caldwell truly represented. His private journals, discovered in a locked trunk after his death in 1891, contained hundreds of pages documenting cases that might have involved Timothy, along with his own theoretical discussions about the nature of evil and the terrifying possibility that some individuals might be born without the capacity for moral reasoning. The Caldwell farm was abandoned after Thomas and Sarah recovered from their ordeal. Neither of them could bear to remain in the place where they had unknowingly harbored a monster. For nearly 2 years, the property was eventually sold, but local residents avoided the area for decades afterward, whispering stories about the cursed land. Thomas and Sarah Caldwell never spoke publicly about their experience with Timothy, but they lived the rest of their lives under assumed names, apparently living in constant fear that the boy, now a man, might someday return to finish what he had started. In his final journal entry, written just days before his own death, Dr. Harding reflected on the broader, more terrifying implications of Timothy's case. I have spent 24 years of my life trying to understand what Timothy Caldwell represented, he wrote, and I fear that I have finally reached a most disturbing conclusion. Timothy was not an aberration. He was a glimpse into what a human being might become when stripped of all the moral and emotional constraints that we consider fundamental to our nature. If he survived to adulthood, and I have no doubt that he did, then somewhere in America, there walks a man who understands human psychology better than any trained professional, who can manipulate people with a skill that seems almost supernatural, and who views the rest of humanity as nothing more than subjects for his endless, horrifying experiments. This dark chapter of history shows us that the most terrifying evil can wear the most innocent of faces, and that our assumptions about childhood and human nature may be dangerously, fatally naive. The case of Timothy forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the origins of morality and the chilling possibility that some individuals may be born without the conscience without the capacity for empathy that we consider fundamental to being human. What do you think happened to Timothy? Do you believe the story ends here? Or could there be more to his fate than the official records suggest? Leave your comment below and let us know your thoughts on this disturbing piece of American history. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark and you wish to take more, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who appreciates mysteries as complex and unsettling as this one. Remember, the truth is often far more terrifying than fiction, and history is filled with secrets that continue to challenge our very understanding of what it means to be human. We will see you in the next video.